Hello everyone, today I will be presenting and examining four metaphysical questions. Um, Obviously, I will be analyzing and trying to answer the questions that I chose for a video exam. Um, all my information will be related to PVI's analysis and textbook and our discussion in class for all the four foundational questions. I picked the metaphysical nihilism question, the eternalism and the nature of time question, Berkeley's idealism, and the metaphysical implications of Ted Chiang's story of your life. Each of these questions raise a fundamental philosophical question. When it comes to metaphysical nihilism, this asks whether it was possible that nothing at all existed. Eternalism is asking whether the past, present, and future are all equally real. Then I was really compelled by Berkeley's idealism in the discussion in class that we had, which if matter exists independently of minds. And then finally, Ted Chiang's story, which explores what human life might look like if time were experienced in a similar way to eternalism. And I think I found this compelling because of the language method and the implications that it comes with. So, taken together, these views obviously challenge some of the deepest assumptions about reality. Moving on, I'm going to move on to the first question, which is what is metaphysical nihilism and how is it different from moral nihilism? So, PVI's introduction to metaphysical nihilism, it pretty much is the view that is defined as the claim that there could be a world in which nothing existed at all. Not just people or planets, but literally nothing. No objects whatsoever. PVI then, in my understanding of the topic and his discussion was, it, it connects with to me, a classical philosophical question. Why is there something rather than nothing? You know? And what the metaphysical nihilism argues is that the existence of things might be entirely contingent, which I will get on later in our discussion. So, if everything that exists is contingent, then it seems logical that none of the things existed. And obviously, in class, my partner and I, in that little discussion, we discussed and gave examples of how this could be real. And our assumption was to reduce everything to infinity, and then we can only assume that there is nothing at all. Because one of the major motivations for this view then comes from the idea that many objects in the universe appear to be dependent or contingent beings, which it was also a discussion that we had in class, which I found really compelling. I would give you an example. Um, there's particular people, animals, and planets. They all came into existence at specific times and could easily have failed to exist. We can only assume this because if things are existed, then we can also assume that some people, some animals, and some planets also can fail to exist. So if everything that exists is like this, then, as I said before, it is conceivable that there might have been nothing at all. Or we can also reduce it to infinity. We have a set of conditions that can be reduced and reduced and reduced to quarks, to atoms, to the smallest things possible. The way that PVI, like I said, from my understanding, is this possibility can be seriously, but then he also raises difficulties with it. Some scholars argue that certain things, like logical truth or abstract objects, might exist necessarily. So, if one of the things necessarily exists, then a world with absolutely nothing may be impossible. It is truly important to think and distinguish the the metaphysical nihilism from moral nihilism. As I said, these two are completely different from each other. Where moral nihilism is it's a complete different thesis. It claims that there are no objective moral facts, which then, according to moral nihilism, statements such as murder is wrong, they do not describe an objective truth about the world. So, from my understanding, I think that there is a significant difference between both of them. Metaphysical nihilism, it concerns whether anything exists at all, and the moral nihilism concerns whether moral truth exists. I think these positions operate entirely different from a philosophical standpoint. One is concerned with ontology, and the other one obviously is concerned with ethics, which is the study of moral value. What makes metaphysical nihilism philosophically important is that it's forcing us to confront the ultimate contingency of existence, as it says right here, the nature of contingent existence. It means that something exists but could have failed to exist. Its being is not logically necessary, raising questions about its ultimate origin. But as I previously said, some um, scholars and philosophers think that there is logical and abstract objects that might be necessary. Moving along those lines, I'm gonna go to number 2. So, question number 2 is eternalism. So, eternalism, we can view it as a block. It it discusses the time as the past, present, and future, and all these events exist equally. So, according to this view, reality is not constantly coming into existence moment by moment, but instead, the entire timeline of the universe exists as a complete four-dimensional structure. Philosophers call this the block universe, uh, which in this model, time is treated similarly to space, but it's a bit different. Um, Different moments in time also exist simultaneously, which then represents that the present moment feels special to us only because it is the point in time that we currently experience. I am I was really compelled by the A series and B series, which we got introduced by. Um, put it simple, the A series, it describes time in terms of past, present, and future, which these properties are constantly changed. These properties are constantly changing. Um, an example that I had, it was an event that is future would eventually become present and then past. Then the B series, as it says right here, is static. Um, it describes the time in terms of earlier than and later than relations, which then these relations do not change at all. So if one event occurs before another, that relationship remains permanently true. Eternalists then typically argue that the B series captures the true structure of time. According to this view, The distinction between past, present, and future are not objective features of reality, but rather reflect our perspective as temporal beings moving through the timeline. A I know that Professor Mihir would not like this, but in my opinion, I I think that connecting eternalism to determinism is probably the most compelling uh, from this block picture. So if eternalism is correct, then every event in time, including future events, already exist within this temporal structure of the universe. So Professor Mihur, once again, I don't think you are going to agree with this, and I would like to know your opinion about this. Um, but I've ever since I told you I was gonna try to think and try to make this work, I've I've tried my best. So hope you like it, even though you obviously don't believe in this or are not compelled by this. So tomorrow's event or many tomorrows it's not something that will come into existence later, but they are already part of the four-dimensional structure of reality. So to me, it's suggesting that the future might be a metaphysical fixed. It means that future events already exist, then it seems impossible for them to occur differently than they actually do. The future would just be as determined as the past. Um, I I try to put a helpful um, analogy, which is the film reel. Um, the film reel is so pretty much when we watch a movie, we experience these scenes sequentially, but the entire film already exists on this reel. The ending is not undecided while we watch the beginning. Instead, it's just already part of the completed structure of the film. Um, so similarly, if eternalism is correct, then our experiences of time passing may just simply be an effect or a reflection of our limited perspective moving through a timeline that already exists. But obviously, as you might be wondering and might be questioning me, there is a really important philosophical problem here, which, if the future is already part of reality, then it might appear that our actions are predetermined. But obviously, many philosophers argue that determinism does not necessarily eliminate freedom. So even if our choices are located within the structure of time, they may still be genuinely our choices. So this tension between eternalism and determinism and human freedom obviously remains one of the most important debates, in my opinion, in metaphysics of time. Moving along, uh, I'm going to talk about the Berkeley's idealism. Um, in class, we talked about his perspective of honestly probably one of the most radical alternatives to materialism. So he rejects the existence of material substance, and then instead he argues that reality consists entirely of minds and ideas. As I put it right here, I try to put it in a more structured way possible, which I think it was a bit hard. Um, so his principle of meaning, which is to be perceived, um, it means that we perceive objects in the world, like trees, tables, or mountains. We don't actually experience material substances themselves. Instead, we experience sensory ideas. So, like the colors, sounds, shapes, and textures. He argues that because we never perceive matter itself, there is no reason to posit a material substance which underlies our perception. Instead, the world consists of ideas that exist within minds. Uh, it pretty much explains that Berkeley's metaphysics includes two kinds of entities. I try to put these entities separate. So, spirits or minds which perceive and think. So, minds which actively perceive, thinking, and willingly, which is the only true substances. And then we have ideas, which are the objects of perception. So, they only exist within minds, what we perceive through our senses. But one of the most common objections to Berkeley's idealism, uh, to me, is the question of persistence. So if objects only exist only when perceived, what happens when no humans observers are present? Which in class we discussed about this, and I was still intrigued about it. Um, Berkeley, if I'm not mistaken, then he answers this question obviously by appealing to God's continuous perception. So, because God constantly perceived the world, then objects remain stable and consistent even when no human minds observe them. But then, interesting, he believes that his theory actually supports realism rather than denying it. If I'm not, like I said before, if I'm not mistaken, correct me if I'm wrong, I don't think he denies that the world exists. But I think from our class discussion, he denied that the world is composed of matter, as I was putting it right here. Their world is real, but fundamentally mental rather than material. So I think many philosophers, even myself, remain skeptical of his idealism. I think his argument emphasizes an important epistemological problem, which is our access to the external world, which is always mediated through perception. And I think this goes beyond metaphysics and actually then goes into epistemology. Um, then my last question is, or the last question was, which of the stories you like the most about Ted Chiang, and what is some of the metaphysical uh, problems or things that you found interesting about it? I chose the story of your life because I think um, its central metaphysical issue is the nature of time and determinism. As you can see, I'm really fascinated by determinism, and I will talk about it as much as I can. Um, we just see this story about a linguistic um, whose name is Louis. She learns the language of an alien species that in the book they call the heptapods. So their written language represents entire statements simultaneously rather than sequentially. So because of this, the heptapods experience time differently from humans. So as humans, or Lewis in this case, and her other colleague learn their language, her perception of time changes. She begins to experience her life in a way that resembles eternalism, which, obviously, as previously discussed, is where past, present, and future, all these events are all part of a complete structure. So, one of the most emotionally powerful aspects of the story is that Louise foresees the entire future of her daughter's life, including her eventual death. So, despite this knowledge, she still chooses to have her daughter and live through those experiences. Which, to me, there's a philosophical question here. To me, is if the future is already fixed, do our choices still have a meaning? And I think you can argue that yes, but independently, maybe not. So, what I mean by this is, um, maybe Lewis has to act like she has free will, knowingly that all her choices are already predetermined. Um, but I think this story suggests that meaning doesn't necessarily depend on uncertainty. So even if the structure of time is fixed, the human's experiences, such as like love, relationships, and sacrifices, they still remain deeply meaningful. I think Chang's story is powerful because it transforms an abstract metaphysical theory about time into a deeply human narrative about choice, knowledge, and acceptance. Um, well, in conclusion, um, the philosophical questions, metaphysical nihilism, eternalism, Berkeley's idealism, and the metaphysics, exploring Ted Chiang's story, I think, for me at least, they challenge my everyday assumptions about reality. These questions ask whether the universe has to exist at all, if time truly flows, if matter exists independently of minds, and if our minds or lives remain meaningful if the future already exists. By engaging in these ideas, I don't necessarily, nor it's a requirement to accept them. However, they have deepened my understanding of the metaphysical questions that philosophers have struggled um, and will keep struggling for centuries. Thank you, and hope you enjoyed this.